Morning. This morning, like 4 minutes before service started, I went up to Kevin and I said, "Hey, is there anything I can do to help you this morning?" And little did I know that I'd put in his first song completely incorrectly. So good to know I can be helpful. But no, I do appreciate very much all the work that goes into making sure that we have everything that we need to do our worship service on Sunday mornings, and thankful to all the men and the women behind them for stepping up and being flexible and just ultimately ensuring that when we come together for worship, that it's done with a true and honest and meaningful heart. And as I was thinking about the mistake made on the slides, I thought about the book series that I used to read when I was growing up. Every book in the series was essentially a time machine visit to a different point in history. And there would be an adventure, and then they'd have to worry about how to get back into the time machine, or is their treehouse, and how to get back in the time machine and go back to their present day age. And I thought about, if I had that ability going back to the early Christians, the early church, and you know, hey, Philip, you forgot the scroll at home. You brought the wrong scroll. Oh well, I guess I'll get on my camel and I'll ride, through the desert and go back and get it. And so, I just laugh thinking about, human nature. And when you're in a rush, when you're doing things, the day before, you make mistakes like transposing numbers together, and anyways, it was just something fun that I thought of. But also, kind of along that same theme, um, decided to do something a little bit different from me and take a page out of Jordan's book. Jordan's done a large number of character studies ever since our work started here in Ellicott City. And I texted Jordan. I said, "Hey, I want to do a character study, but I don't want to necessarily rehash one that you've already done." And so he went and he looked, and it was really cool to look back on all the character studies we've done. And I wanted to talk about Joshua this morning. And so, if you will, hop into our into our time machine and go back and kind of learn a little bit of the biography of Joshua, but also, of course, um, looking beyond who he was and what he did, but also seeing how we as Christians today can take very much from Joshua. And so, borrowing directly from the outline of Jordan's character studies, we're going to look at three, those three kind of core things, and I think it's going to be really good because a lot of the information, is likely or possibly familiar to you, but if you will, especially in the third point there in the lessons for us, I'd like to really adapt it to our current day situation, our current day reality that we find ourselves in, and hopefully there we'll be able to look beyond the things that maybe we already knew about Joshua. So to kind of go over some basic facts about Joshua, he was born and was from the tribe of Ephraim, and he was actually born named Hoshea, son of Nun, and you can read about that in Numbers 13 and verse 8. And it was actually Moses who changed his name or called him by Joshua. And I thought it was interesting. I looked this up. Hoshea means salvation or he saves. And the name Joshua is very similar, but it adds a divine element to that, meaning Yahweh's salvation or Jehovah saves. And so I thought that was interesting that Moses and Moses being who he was looked upon Joshua and thought and may have seen the things that were to come with Joshua, a little bit of foreshadowing, if you will. And so from the perspective of Joshua and Moses, well, they were very closely associated. Joshua served Moses as an assistant or an aide to him, and very notably, one of the first places that we read about it is in Exodus chapter 24, in verse 13, where Joshua is accompanying Moses as he went up his journey to Mount Sinai to receive the law from God upon Mount Sinai. And Joshua went part way up with him and waited there as Moses was upon the mountain, and then made the journey back down with Moses. And so we see here that he was a in his role as an assistant, he was a servant. He was serving Moses. He was building up that sort of experience. He was building up that mentality, if you will. And also, Joshua desired to be near God's presence. And a really good example of this is in Exodus 33, verses 7 through 11. Moses had set up the tent of meeting, the place that he would go when he would meet with God, and the pillar of clouds, and that magnificence would be seen, um, at the tent. And in those verses there, something that really showed the nature or the character of Joshua, that even as Moses left the tent of meeting, that Joshua chose to remain there, showing and demonstrating or symbolizing his desire to be near God's presence and his pious nature. Joshua was also a soldier, and I know the song that we just sang, that Kevin led us in, talked about being as happy as a soldier can be, and we see here that soldiering during this time was obviously very dangerous. Hand-to-hand combat, arrows, no Kevlar or advanced armor systems. Really, what you had was whatever you could, create using the materials and the raw materials at your disposal. And so a lot of the soldiers during this time were very brave, just as our soldiers today are. But Joshua was found in a leadership position within the military, and very notably in the battle against Amalek, and also known as, to me at least, the battle where Moses had his hands raised, and when his hands would go down, then the Amalekites would get the upper hand, and then when his hands would go back up, the Israelites would get the upper hand, and it was Joshua that led the Israelites to victory in that battle. And Joshua was also chosen by Moses as one of the 12 spies, and we'll certainly look a lot more into that. But when Moses had selected one representative from each tribe to be one of the spies, in Numbers 13, verse 8 and 16, we can see that that's where Joshua was selected. And in short, or maybe as a recap, the spies' mission was to survey the land of Canaan and to determine whether that land was fertile, whether crops grew there, what kind of crops grew there, but also very importantly, whether it would be a challenge to conquer. They wanted to know how many people they had, if those people were strongly fortified, or if they were in a position where it was more like a camp and would be a little bit easier to overtake. All of those things. And again, in Numbers 13, we can read about that agenda for the spies. And so as we move into the second topic, if you will, the second part where we talk about, well, what did Joshua do? I'd like to start by kind of picking up here with spies and their mission here. They spent 40 days in the land of Canaan, and they were exploring there, and they were doing the various things they were told to look out for. They were moving along and keeping an eye out for these different aspects. And when they returned, they all agreed that the land was very fertile. They brought back the large fruit, the grapes that required multiple men to carry, and it was it was the land of milk and honey that they had been told about. However, 10 of the spies were very focused on the obstacles to conquering the land, and they were certain that it could not be done due to the size or the demeanor or the fierceness of the people, then also the fortifications, the different walls and strongholds that were in the land. And it was only Joshua and Caleb, another one of the spies, that trusted in God's promise and that were telling the Israelites that it could be done, that it was God's promise and that it was God's purpose. And so, just on the premise of that alone, it could be done no matter what the apparent obstacles or challenges were. And so I have here Numbers 14, verses 6 through 8, and I'll read directly from what those verses say. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, "The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey." And something that I know when I was first reading the Bible, and I always thought, looking at Job and other places, when people tear their clothes, I always remember thinking like, that's extreme, and it is. That was a sign or point of emphasis that this really means a lot. And so this shows here on these verses and the way that they acted and the opposition that they faced just showed their resolve and showed their commitment to trusting in God's promise. But unfortunately, even still, the Israelites did not trust God. They did not go with what Joshua and Caleb were saying, and they actually threatened to stone Joshua and Caleb. They lamented and talked about how it would have been better to just stay put where they were, and how this whole mission was kind of doomed to fail, if you will. And that made God very unhappy. God's judgment was that this generation that had the opportunity to enter the promised land would never enter the promised land. That um, it would be later generations that would be able to do so. And he sentenced these people, this generation, to wander the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day that the spies had spent surveying the land. And uh, specifically, God spared Joshua and Caleb. You can read about that in Numbers 14, verses 30 and 38. And God instructed Moses, and this is kind of a little bit of a time skip, if you will, between these two bullet points here, but, kind of looking over the course of the wandering in the wilderness, towards the end of Moses' life, God instructed Moses to commission Joshua as his successor, and you can read about that in Numbers 27. And so, as we just mentioned, God had instructed Moses to commission Joshua as his successor, but in Joshua, in the opening verses of chapter 1, I have verses 1 through 9 up here on the slide, and I want to read through it because this is God directly commissioning Joshua, if you will. And so, here it reads, After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, then you will have good success. For have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And of course, for me, I think of um, the hymn that we sing talking about be strong and courageous, and also uh, another hymn or another verse from him that talks about I will not leave you or forsake you. And these verses are very powerful, and the words that are being said to Joshua in that commission show the kind of meaningfulness that we can gain from having the support, knowing that God has our back, and that even though we're going to face situations where that strength and that courage is required, that we have been given everything that we need, and we can do all that we are being asked to do. And so, as we continue to look at what Joshua did after he was given leadership or after he took over for Moses, his first major act as leader was leading Israel into the promised land by crossing the Jordan River. And the flow of that river being stopped, as you can read about in Joshua 3, was kind of his version of Moses and the Red Sea, was this kind of um, supernatural, if you will, something that only God would be capable of doing to stop the geographical effects and the wild, essentially nature, so that they could cross into Promised Land. And while it wasn't necessarily the first time that an Israelite had stepped into that land, it was the official going into the Promised Land, as it was promised by God, where the people and that next generation that were that were granted the opportunity to actually enter into the promised land were able to do so. And so in Joshua 5 verses 13 through 15, um, we look at to we look at the point where they've crossed over the river, and now they're at their first major obstacle, which is Jericho, a fortress, a citadel with a great wall and many defenders. And so, reading in Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, it reads, When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, What does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. And so, as he's at this, at the outside of the citadel and thinking about the different challenges that are going to be presented here, this encounter, if you will, comes up. And something that is really um, meaningful to me is in verse 14, where Joshua falls on his face. Again, another one of those symbols or another one of those gestures to show reverence or to show, lowering yourself, humbling yourself to worship. And that's exactly what he did. He worshiped and said to him, What does my Lord say to his servant? And something I mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about kind of the background and who Joshua was, well, that kind of servant mentality, we hear all the time about servant leadership. At this point, he's already a leader. He's already been commissioned um, by by God, but he's also received that from Moses and from God directly. And yet still he has this humility and he has this servant mindset, and that you know you could very well argue is what makes a lot of leaders great, is that they don't lose that mentality, that aspect. And so we talk all the time about humility and how difficult it can be. Truly we see that it is one of these virtues that allows us to be great and allows us to more effectively do God's will. And so I always think that this encounter is really neat, because as soon as he realizes you know, essentially what's going on here, he immediately falls into the proper etiquette, if you will. And so, moving into the next chapter, into Joshua 6, in verses 2 through 7, it reads, And the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the seventh day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and people shall go up, every one straight before him. And well, you don't have to be a military mastermind to kind of raise your eyebrows a little bit and think this is an interesting battle strategy, right? There's no talk of, you know, essentially trying to lower a drawbridge or trying to, construct catapults or, you know, trebuchets, you know, missile launchers or whatever. There's just talk about trumpets marching and going around, and then also not just one day, but this kind of 7 day plan, if you will. And Joshua, having that military background, that military leadership, certainly could have chosen to be puzzled and kind of apprehensive, have second thoughts about this, right? But in verse 6, we see, So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. And he said to the people, Go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord. And I think not just about faith and the trust that Joshua had in this plan, but the kind of leader that he was, that the people would go along with this too, right? Because he kind of receiving that firsthand, if you will, and then people receiving it from him, the trust that they must have had in him, and um, the amount of doubt that they were able to quash and that they were able to put aside, as we look and carry on into verse 20, where we see the result of this. So in verse 20 it reads, So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. And so we see the result. And uh, you know, again, thinking about that time machine and wanting to kind of be a fly on the wall, if you will, in that moment. How many of them were surprised? They clearly believed enough to go along with it, but when it actually happened, how many of them were surprised at the result? And hey, it was really true. I just imagine that was a really just amazing moment. I don't know that I'll ever see or experience anything in my life that would be able to rival that. And so, as we look past the conquest and the falling of the walls of Jericho, we see um, that throughout other chapters and ensuing chapters of Joshua, that he continued to lead successful campaigns. And actually, Joshua 11:23 is a pretty good summary of those campaigns. And I have a map that's probably way too small to read, but kind of shows the span and shows multiple campaigns here: a northern, central, and southern campaign. But verse 23 of Joshua 11 reads, So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war. And at the end of his life, or towards the end of his life, Joshua challenged the Israelites to remain faithful. In Joshua 24, and verses 14 through 15, it reads, and Joshua says, Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And you'll see a lot of people that have that sentence or that statement, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You'll see that oftentimes up in people's houses, and it's a really powerful verse. And so, I would certainly say it deserves to be up in people's homes. But this call that Joshua made has so much significance when you think back to when he was a younger man for the 40 years in the wilderness, and when he was a spy and he was facing and was speaking with his countrymen essentially, and having to convince them that no, let's follow through and let's trust in God and let's do this plan, and then seeing the terrible result that happened, that it was too little too late when they had decided to invade at that point. They were crushed and they were defeated, and as we talked about, the wandering in the wilderness. And this call here at the end of his life, we talked a little bit in Bible class this morning about how people's attitude might change as they know that they're at the end of their life, and that God knows our hearts and he knows kind of what our thought process is, right? We're not going to outsmart God. We're not going to pull a fast one there. But our moments at the end of our life are obviously quite limited, and so everything, every thought, every word, every statement matters. And this is what Joshua told to talk chose. This is what Joshua chose to talk about. This is what was important to him at the end of his life, was that the Israelites would remain faithful and not make the same mistakes that they had before. And so in Joshua 24 verse 29, we see that Joshua lived to be 110 years old. We see that his leadership and his faith had been extremely impactful, not just to his current generation, but also to generations to come. As we read in Joshua 24, verse 31, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. And you think about the end of a person's life, you think about cemeteries and maybe even headstones, and how sometimes those headstones will have different things written on them. And what an epilogue, what a kind of closing line or a eulogy this would be. To have this be your legacy and to have this be your contribution, it's just amazing. And so it is certainly amazing for me to look back at Joshua's life and see all the different things that he did and the impact that he had. And it makes me wonder for myself, what kind of impact can I have? Obviously, you know, not to that scale, but just to the people around me, that those who knew me would think not just well of me, but think well of serving God and think well of Christ, and hopefully see a reflection of Christ in the way that he lived, in the way that I lived. And that should be our goal for all of us as Christians, that when others look at us, that they see at least a little bit, right, of Christ reflected back, and that they would see an attempt, they would see a struggle, and they would see hard work towards trying to make that true. And so that kind of is a good segue into lessons for us, and the sentiments that I want to close on this morning. I have a few different things that are going to be underlined here that are going to be kind of a takeaway, and then we'll look at kind of how Joshua is an example of that, but then also look at some other verses that show and carry the same sentiment. So the first is that God prepares us oftentimes by serving others. We talked about this a little bit with Joshua's service to Moses. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6, it reads, Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. And then Matthew 20, verse 28, looking at Christ, and of course, with Christ being the example, we can see, as this verse says, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And then in Luke chapter 16, verse 10, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. And so the takeaway from that verse especially is that we shouldn't look down on opportunities to serve others, whether they're big or small. There may be some things, I think sometimes at work, people receive tasks that they think are below them, right? They're like, hey, I'm got all this knowledge, I've got all this degree, and you want me to, take notes at this meeting? That's below me. The thought being, well, you could flip that around and say, well, if I can't even trust you to take notes, I'm not going to trust you to do this important calculation or, whatever it may be. And so, that humility, not just, extending, not just being limited to our work and to our earthly lives, but also to our spiritual lives, that there is no person that's, too small or too insignificant to be worth saving or talking to. And there's no opportunity to serve others in that same vein that is too small or too insignificant. We should take all of those things seriously. The next lesson for us is that faith requires us to see God's promises even when there are challenges. And the obvious example to this is when Joshua and Caleb trusted God, and they saw the same thing that all the other spies saw. That the other spies weren't necessarily lying about the things that they saw. It was the way that it was their attitude and the way that they chose to respond and convey that information. Their takeaway, the 10 spies' takeaway, was based on fear and you know just as Kevin was saying in the last song, they said I can't. They had a can't do attitude, whereas Joshua and Caleb had a can do attitude. And it wasn't that they're, it's not to say that they weren't scared or that they didn't see the same challenges that everybody else saw. It was that they allowed their trust in God to outweigh those fears. Another good example is with Joshua trusting God's instructions to conquer Jericho. And so in Hebrews 11, verse 1, it reads, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. And something else that really makes me think when Jordan's going to get a couple of shout outs from me this morning, Jordan has always done for me a really good job um, in his Lord's Supper talk. And he did it a little bit this morning too, talking about how Christ knew, and he had an awareness, right? Of course, knowing all the things that he did, he knew the pain and the suffering that was to come. And in Luke chapter 22, verses 41 through 42, it reads, and he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And that is one of the kind of most impactful things to me is when somebody knows that it's going to be a tough road ahead and that terrible things are going to happen, but they put the importance of others or they put the importance of things bigger than them above them. And I think this verse is obviously the ultimate example of that. But when we look at the different things that Joshua and Caleb faced in their journeys and the challenges that they had to overcome, you can't help but think of all the different places. What's stopping us? All the different places in our lives where we allow small things to, we let ourselves convince, our own minds convince us that it can't be done or that it shouldn't be done. Here looking at Christ as the greatest example of a challenge that was overcome. I just kind of keep playing back that last sentence to me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And the next lesson is that courage often means standing with God, even if we are alone from man. And even if standing with God would put us alone or away from other people, that's okay, right? That may be unfortunate to us because we feel ostracized or we feel like we're out on an island, but that standing with God is the most important thing. And so the example of this, when Joshua and Caleb stood against the majority and were threatened even to be stoned and killed by their peers, God repeatedly told Joshua to be strong and courageous and that he would be with him. In Acts chapter 5, verse 29, Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. In Psalm 27, verse 1, reads, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? And so we see here this important message to be strong and courageous, and that's not just when we're in a place that makes us physically feel scared, like thinking about in Iceland. April and the girls, Ashley and I were so fortunate to be able to go with April and her girls to Iceland, and we went into this cave, and we had headlamps and other sources of illumination on, and the tour guide said, now turn off your light, and it was truly pitch black. It felt more dark than if I closed my own eyelids. That that was a moment where you would feel physically scared, and this reminder to be strong and courageous doesn't only apply to those situations where we might feel physically endangered, but this applies to when we are in these social situations, in these cultural situations where we feel like we are being ostracized, where we feel like that others are threatening to no longer be our friend, or whatever it may be, to be strong and courageous and to continue with God's will. And that can be obviously very difficult to do. And then just kind of final couple lessons here for us, that faithfulness leaves a lasting legacy. We talked about that, talked about the example that we can be to our family, to our friends. And then obedience to God brings victory. In John 14 verse 15 it reads, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." In James chapter 1 verse 22 it says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." And so we see that looking at the triumph that Christ had over death, and looking at the triumph that God had over Satan, and we see that our obedience to God is what allows us to bring or to achieve the victory. Joshua was strong and courageous, and we've looked at a lot this morning that we can learn from his life. And now we have to ask ourselves the question: do we have the strength and courage to do what is required? We talked about having the strength and courage to make it through those social situations where we feel like we're alone, but this is more about looking internally and looking at our own lives, and do we have the knowledge? Is the knowledge what's holding us back from being obedient to God and doing what's required of us? Or is it our own, again, our own minds trying to convince us that now is not the right time, or that we're not worthy, or that we shouldn't? And I know Craig has mentioned wanting to modernize this graphic, but until he does, this is still the one to use. And so we look again at God's part and man's part, and especially looking at those who have already come to the point of hearing and believing, and now it's about taking action, and it's about really those verses that we looked at just now in James and in John, being doers of the word. We have to repent, confess, and be baptized, and then we have to remain faithful. Not saying that any of those are easy things, but this invitation this morning is to invite you, if you need help with any of those things, to have strength and courage to come forward and to let that be known and to ask for help, right? It takes courage to ask for help. It takes courage to raise your hand and ask a question that you think others might think is silly or is obvious. Same kind of thing. You may know what's required of you, but to have the strength and the courage to come forward and to make that be known and to come to God and acknowledge those things. In Acts chapter 2, verse 38, and Peter said to them, "Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness of your sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit." So if you need to be baptized, or if you have any need at all, I invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.